Greg, it's up to you and Chris now to talk to us about building along the structure from Conowingo models.
All right. I should be unmuted and I will be getting this started. I have no script tonight, so forgive me if I stumble some. So tonight we'll be doing a build along with the Conowingo models, Gray Street House, the company house version in HO scale. We'll be covering an O scale version of it a little later. Tonight we'll be doing part 2, bracing the walls and building the base for the kit. I'll be covering techniques that any modeler will know. Here's what I'm doing with this kit. The first thing you'll do is unpack the kit when it comes. On the left, we have the Gray Street House as it was first introduced, and that's also the way the O scale kit comes. On the right is the way the company house version comes. That includes the porch and the base, the foundation. I usually start by sorting out my strip wood. In this case, we have some bracing for the walls, the corner bracing, and some flat trim to go on the walls. You'll start by cutting out the walls, and you'll want to cut them carefully. There's a couple thin parts, especially over that door on the back wall. One thing I do is orient the clapboard. In most cases, you don't have to worry about it. You'll have a door or a roof or something that makes it obvious. But in some cases, like the upper story back wall on this one, it's identical right side up and upside down. So I'll put a mark on the back of it so I don't put it in wrong side up. You'll want to clean up the edges of your walls. You can use a sanding stick for that or a file. What you'll be wanting to do is get out all of the little nubbins from where you cut it out of the carrier sheet and clean out inside the windows. You want to be careful doing this. With this kit, there's one particular wall that if you're holding it like on the left, you stand a good chance of breaking the wood. I hold it on the right, and you always want to look at any kit you're working on and make sure when you're working on it, you're not likely to break something. I do have an Ultimation sander, which I absolutely love. This is before I put the repeater on it. It makes jobs like this a little easier. It's not required for this build, but I would definitely say that if this interests you, you look into it. The next thing I'll do is measure my strip wood for the bracing. Then I'll mark it where I want to cut it. I'll go through all the bracing and mark it before I start cutting them. The reason being, in a case like this, the bracing on the left is already spoken for, and I have a little less than 2 inches left, and the wall is 1 inch high. So you can see that if I cut it at line A, I wouldn't have enough left for the other side of the wall. So what I'll do is compromise and cut it in between the two lines. And this way each piece is almost long enough and it'll work fine. And I've been able to utilize both pieces of bracing. I use a chopper when I cut my strip wood. I find it very handy, but you don't need to. You can use a razor blade or you can use a razor saw for cutting. After I get it all cut, I'll lay everything out and make sure I have it all ready to go, so I only have to go through the gluing one time. I'll then put each piece with the wall and get ready to glue them on. I typically use a toothpick for applying the glue. When I put it on, I try and spread it out and get it so that there's not so much it's going to squeeze out anywhere. As I said last week, For a lot of this type of work, I use an Aleene's tacky glue or an Elmer's strong white glue. I'll also use a 1-2-3 block as a base if I'm gluing the bracing right up against the very edge of the wall. I just push the wall against it and then push the bracing up against it. One thing I want to point out, wet glue can be very slippery, and if you put something down, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally move it before it dries in place. I've had that happen. With some other pieces of bracing, you'll need to leave a 3/32 inch gap, which is the size of the bracing in this kit. That's so it can butt up another piece of bracing on the end of a wall. One thing that I do, whether a kit comes with a ridge beam or not, I'll leave room to put one in and just use some scrap strip wood to do it. If I have a piece of bracing coming up to the peak of the roof, I'll leave whatever space I need to so that the ridge beam can sit right on that piece of bracing. Then once I get the pieces glued onto a wall, I'll weight them down with a 1-2-3 block and let them dry while I'm working on the rest. Once we have all the bracing glued onto the wall, we're going to set them aside, and we won't be using them or touching them until the next week. The next thing we're going to do is start on the base for this kit. After you cut all the pieces of wood out of the carrier sheets, you start piecing them together to see how it goes together. The numbers that Chris has put on these really help in this case. I like to glue two corners together first. In this case, I have two corners being held together with the block in the middle and the other two corners being held by the other block. So the one in the middle is doing double duty. Once they're dry, I put the two halves together and then make sure that it's square while it's drying. Once you've glued all the pieces together, this is what the completed base ends up looking like. He's given a skirting to go around underneath the porch and underneath the steps. You'll be careful cutting this out, it's very thin. After I glued it on, one of the things I wanted to do was distress the bottom of it a little bit. It's going to be sitting on ground, and the bottom of the wood would be the most worn away and the most damaged of the wood. Once they were glued on, I wanted to stain them. You can paint them if you want the color of whatever the building you're painting, but I wanted to stain mine. So I went through looking for the color that I wanted to use. I decided to use a light color on the top and a dark color on the bottom to show where the wood was starting to rot away up against the earth. This is what it looks like after I was done staining it, showing the distressed wood. The next thing we'll be applying is the brick veneer. This comes on a sheet of paper that's embossed. I find it really easy to use the mortar lines for cutting it out. You get a nice straight line that way. First, you want to measure how high it is you need. And don't always assume that the edge of the sheet that you get is cut straight. I'll usually cut off the top edge before I start measuring down and cutting what I want. Once it's cut out, I'll just use white glue and glue it in place. I use clothespins to hold it while it's drying. Next, I wanted to do the steps. The way I did this is I used a darker stain on the outside and a lighter stain in the middle to show that it's a little worn. You can get the same effect by staining it one color and then sanding a little bit in the middle. Then I started attaching the steps. There's two places where they go. One thing you want to do when you're putting on the back steps, put the back wall in place to see where the door might go, and make sure your steps are wide enough that if the back wall is just a little bit off, that the steps still cover where the door comes out. I made my steps just a little oversized to make sure of that. The last thing I did for the base was go around the top edge and paint it black. The paper shows a white edge, and once you put the house on it, there's a chance that a little bit of that white edge is going to show through. By painting the top of it black, you won't be able to see it. So this is what the base looks like once it's completed. We've got the steps in place, and I've got the black paint covering the top edge of the white paper all the way around. And we have the wood siding put in the front of it. We'll tackle the porch in a couple of weeks. That's the next part that'll be worked on the base. Now, if you've gotten the O-scale kit, you don't get the base and the porch with it. Chris just finished developing the HO version as we started this. I will be showing a way that you can fabricate a porch and a foundation for it. You're going to have to do a little bit of your own scratch building with it, but we'll try and help you along the way. A couple of the products that we found that will work for helping with this. Railscale Models offers a brick foundation in O-scale, and they also offer some O-scale stringers and steps. The foundation that he offers comes in a variety of heights, so you can pretty much set it any size you want. These products are also offered from other manufacturers. You can look around. You could also build something your own if you wanted to, but this would make it pretty easy. I've used the O-scale steps from Railscales before on a previous build, and they're very well made. They come out very nice, and there's enough there to probably last you 10 or more kits unless you're building a second story landing. This also shows the foundation that's available. Next week, we'll be covering the painting. And I'm going to ask Geoff to say a couple of words about the lighting. He's gotten one of these, and he's going to be talking about how to light it. So, Geoff, if you can, go ahead.
Okay. This is a relatively straightforward and relatively simple. This is building a light box, a light block box. I had intended to only light the corner of the downstairs on the street side, and I wanted those two windows to be included, but I didn't want any of the other windows to come on. So I simply got out my scissors. I like working with paper or card that's opaque. And this just happened to be next to me. It's an old corner of a Athearn Blue Box kit. So I just cut it out to that dimension. I didn't get it right the first 3 times. I kept cutting until I got it to be what I wanted it to be. But you could see how you're going to wind up blocking the light out for those 2 windows in the corner eventually. I'm not particularly concerned about the bracing because with a sharp X-Acto knife or scalpel or what I typically use, believe it or not, are a brand new pair of side cutters, which I keep only for paper and soft wood. You can go and snip out whatever you need to fit it. And if you still don't do it right, you can simply take glue like Elmer's or Eileen's, run like a caulking smear on the corner, and then paint over it to do the light block. The one thing I blissfully didn't account for, because I didn't think I'd need it, was the flooring, because it's got the foundation beneath it. But it'd be just as easy to put a piece of paper underneath that to simulate that and block the light out there. I'm trying to show you just what the idea is here. to create the block inside the building. And then I'm looking at whether or not I'm going to light up the window up here in the front as well, but only that front window. But anyway, the idea is to confine the light so that you can turn that on or off only for that particular room. And that's prep. You don't really need to do it now, but since you're working with outlining the way you want the building to be in the future, and you're going to get to painting it eventually, it's a good thing to think about right now. Again, because it's a basswood building, I typically like to use a light grade of cardboard to do the light blocks inside. Okay, that's it.
All right, so that's the end of the Conowingo Build Along Part 2. If there's any questions, and like I said, next week we'll be covering painting.
Well, Greg, thank you so very much. I really do appreciate you doing this, and Chris too. And I think this is just fantastic. And Geoff, thanks so much for talking about the lighting for the inside of the building.